Oh, howdy all, grab yourself a drink. It is time for some PathOfExile 1 discussion. Less than 4 days now until we're able to play patch 3.26 and Secrets of the Atlas. And whilst this video is going to talk a little bit about some new patch notes that are especially going to affect people who are playing cold damage over time spellcasters, our primary focus today is going to be on the Mercenaries of Trarthus League mechanics, because that's what Grinding Gear Games have provided us a bunch of new information about. Firstly, they put up an article that has 5 new items that are going to exist inside the Mercenaries League. This includes some gems, but it also includes some rare items that you'll be able to potentially find. Now, fair warning, any of these rare items, and also for that matter even these gems, they could be fairly difficult to get your hands on. We know that you can't get the Trarthus gems until you're solidly at endgame, but we don't know how rare they're going to be. It might be the case that we're just drowning in them once we're in maps, but it might also be the case that you only see one every 100 maps or so, and if there's 35 of them and most people want the same one or two, then that particular gem is going to be pretty rare as a result. We'll have to find out on that. The key thing is make sure that you've got a backup plan until you can acquire the gem that you want if you want to use one of these Trarthus gems. So the first one that's being teased today is Wave of Conviction of Trarthus. Now this works very differently to the normal Wave of Conviction gem. Normal Wave of Conviction causes a wave to propagate out from you. It's something like a 90-degree cone, and it deals physical damage that's part converted to fire, part converted to lightning. It's also a gem that people often use in conjunction with Ignite. One of the key things with it is that it has a rider on it that if an elemental type of damage is the most damage that the gem does, then it will inflict exposure to that type of element as well. Wave of Conviction is a pretty solid spell. Wave of Conviction of Trarthus is something entirely different though. This is a point-blank AoE that hits twice. It expands from your character, then it contracts back on your character. This deals physical damage half converted to fire, which on its own is pretty clunky, but you can full convert it to fire without too much difficulty. And the fact that it was once physical means that you can use it alongside anything that grants physical damage added as extra fire damage, which there's quite a number of sources in the game. All that said, I'm not all that impressed with this particular gem, but I'm withholding judgment on one key thing. And that is, we don't know exactly how the propagation of this wave works. You can only have one of them out at a time, so it does carry on that effect from Wave of Conviction original version. We don't know whether reducing the duration of the Wave of Conviction of Trarthus causes it to expand and contract quicker, in which case maybe it is something that can be used effectively. Alternately, and probably more likely in my opinion, it might move at a static speed, and anything that reduces its duration will reduce the amount that it's able to expand. If that's the case, I don't really see much of a use case for this particular gem. Remember, just like the original Wave of Conviction, you can only have one of them on the screen at a time. Also, don't even think of using this with traps or mines. Traps and mines, the primary use case of them is to detonate lots of copies of the same spell at the same time. And Wave of Conviction of Trarthus, just like OG Wave of Conviction, you can only have one of them on the screen at any given time. Next, we have Heavy Strike of Trarthus. The numbers are here on this. The damage projection kind of needs to be. It probably isn't because it's Heavy Strike, but this is one to play around with at least. Attack damage on this is fantastic, 552.5% of base damage. Attack speed is a clunky but not miserable 85% of base, so it is very slow, but it's got some really interesting additional text on it that's going to cause that damage to not really just be 552.5, but potentially be much more. Increases and reductions to spell damage also apply to attack damage from this skill at 150% of their value, and 2% chance to deal double damage per 10 intelligence on your character. Note there's no point stacking this second stat any higher than 500 intelligence for 100% chance to deal double damage. Getting more than 100% chance doesn't cause you to double once, then potentially double again. Instead, you just double once. Now, very important to note, this has the text requires a staff. This is going to reward some really weird crafts, and ultimately I think it is far stronger than it would otherwise be because of the existence of recombinators. You'd never otherwise be able to get high tier physical damage percent, high tier physical damage flat, high tier spell damage, high tier attack speed, and a high tier of intelligence. However, with this particular league and recombination being around, you probably can do that, albeit not easily and not necessarily on premium bases. So Heavy Strike of Trarthus is definitely something that can be played around with if you're interested in really exploring some of the depths of crafting within PathOfExile 1. Now, New skills aren't the only thing you'll get from the Trarthus mercs. There are also items that have what's called infamous modifiers. Infamous modifiers are special modifiers, and it's important to just quickly remind yourself of exactly how item levels work in PathOfExile 1. So the minimum level to equip an item is whichever is higher. The minimum level to equip that item if it didn't have any mods on it. So for instance, the General's helmet would be 73, whether it had mods on it or not. Or it is 80% of the minimum level that's required to roll various mods that are on it. I believe, although I'm not certain of this, the 2-point arrow quiver is a fairly low level base. And so what that means is that requires level 54 means that there's a mod on this item that you can't get before about level 68. So based on that, I think it's reasonable to assume, although not necessarily completely proven correct or anything, that these Trarthus modifiers might become available once you get to level 68. And then, of course, the General's helmet just requires 73 on its own, and the Opal wand, I think, is also 62. But let's have a look at the mods themselves. Curses on enemies in your chilling areas have 15% increased effect. This is strong. This is something that requires you to do a number of different things on your character. You need to be inflicting curses. You also need to be dropping down bad stuff on the ground that is cold damage over time. So it's only useful to some people. But if you are playing the sort of build that this can benefit from, cough cough Wintertide Brand, cough cough cold dot Occultist, then this is definitely going to be a welcome mod, something you will definitely want to see on any particular one that you're using. Unfortunately, the other mods lack the context that's necessary to absolutely confirm whether this is a suffix or a prefix on the item, and it would be a lot stronger if it ends up being a suffix. All in all, this item Omeyocan Weaver is not good, but there is definitely some potential for an item that has just this last modifier on it to end up being very good. Also, you can use Recombination and you can also use Fracturing Orbs, both of which will have their moments, in order to try and craft something far better than Omeyocan Weaver with this particular base. But also, please don't forget the humble Split Beast. The Split Beast is a very effective way of just mass removing unwanted modifiers from an item, and it's something you should always keep in mind as a tool that you can use in your arsenal, especially once Split Beasts become a little bit more available in a league. After that, we have Miracle Halo. Your war cries cover enemies in ash for 5 seconds. This is phenomenal. This is, however, a very competitive slot for any of the sorts of builds that might be using war cries and also using fire damage. For example, any of the Volcanic Fissure of Snaking type builds, which is actually high on my radar as something I might league start myself. The reason that I say that this is a very competitive slot there is because most builds want to use the Uber Shaper helmet there. The Uber Shaper helmet, whilst it does come from a very difficult boss, it is also a very accessible item from that boss because it has quite a high drop rate, or at least it did in patch 3.25, which we'll see whether that remains the case in 3.26. And then we finally have this Blink and Mirror Arrow Clones Use Your Gloves modifier that is available on Quivers. Now there's a number of things you can do with this. Part of me is thinking let's use this in conjunction with some sort of unique item. And there's Asenath's Gentle Touch comes to mind as a unique item that causes you to have the ability to cause corpses to explode when you kill them, also inflicts a lot of curses. So that might be something you could consider. But there's also just a lot of other gloves that exist in the game. For example, this provides an alternate source to get yourself the effect of full conversion of your Blink and Mirror Arrow clones to cold without having to use a specific triad grip. And this is probably going to be better. And the item you'd use in conjunction with this is Sorrow. But there's also a lot of other things you can do here. Ultimately, Blink and Mirror Arrows, the transfigured versions of these are already good, and this is going to make them even better than they otherwise would be, just having this as an option to put on your quiver, especially given that it's only one mod on your quiver. As long as you can fracture it on there or do something else, it's going to end up being really, really strong. So that's the infamous modifiers that were teased today, and also the Trarthus and gems. Let's have a look at the changes to the patch notes that took place. We'll start with the simplest one and the one that was up the earliest. This is an update to an earlier patch note change to Omeyocan. Omeyocan was actually undersold the amount that it was being buffed earlier, and it's being buffed more than they said, and that's because there was a limit that was written into the item that actually didn't seem to apply at all. So that limit, the game was wrongly telling you that the item was worse than it is, and they're just removing the additional text that says that it's worse than it is, and on top of that, there are a couple of other changes that were already happening to this item, Omeyocan, that are going to make it better than it was. That said, this is still a very difficult item to use. It wants you to have a very large mana pool, but also at the same time, it has lose 7% of mana per second, and so you need to have a tremendous amount of mana recovery to use that well. After this, we have a change that's being made to the Occultist. So, Bastion, this is the Ascendancy passive skill that was very seldom taken that related to Energy Shield. It is getting quite a bit better. Instead of being something that provides you with a large surge of Energy Shield recovery after you have killed a monster or after your minions have killed a monster, but then proceeds to do absolutely nothing for you when you're fighting a boss. Instead, Bastion is always going to provide 100 energy shield regeneration per second. It used to just be 40. And it's also going to have maximum energy shield on your character is increased by your character's chance to block spell damage. Now, blocking spell damage is something you can easily get to 75% on an Occultist. There's a few things that are available for this. There's a lot of clusters for spell block in the north of the tree. Just be very careful whether they're spell block with a shield or whether they're spell block with a staff. One thing though that you do need to be careful of is that it's very difficult to get attack block in that area, and so ultimately it comes down to two options. The first one is to spec into glancing blows and just accept that you're not getting all that much defense out of block. It's still going to be useful, it's still going to take the edge off big hits, and it's also going to provide you with a big buffer of extra energy shield, and that's because you're getting this 75% increased energy shield as well. So that's one option. But I think for most people, attack block might end up being less than 75% on your Occultist. So you'll have a moderate amount of that, but a huge amount of spell block. Or the other option that you've got is to spec quite heavily into Grace and Ghost Shrouds and have quite a bit of evasion on your character. And then in that case, you can pretty much eschew block entirely, for at least for attacks. And then you can get spell block if you want to have it. And if you do want to have it, then Bastion is going to provide you with an option there. That said, the Occultist Ascendancy does have a lot of other quality nodes you might want to take over Bastion, in which case this buff doesn't really do anything for you. Okay, so let's talk about the other patch notes. These relate to changes to the passive tree. So, a Hasty Demise cluster has been added to the northwest of the Witch's starting location. Provides 30% increased damage over time with spell skills. Note that this is increased, this is not dot multi, and it provides 8% increased cast speed, and 10% reduced skill effect duration. Now, normally reduced skill effect duration is a drawback. However, I think because you're getting 8% cast speed in a cluster that might otherwise already be good, there is a bit of power there. The key thing is going to come down to, is this going to cost you 2 points, 3 points, 4 points, or 5 points to pick up? If this costs 3 points, it's probably worth picking up. If it's going to cost you 4 or more points, it's probably a bit more marginal unless the small nodes are really good. So fairly skippable here. Harsh Lessons is the next one. Again, will live or die depending upon the number of points that it takes, but this is going to be in the northeast part of the Witch's starting location. It provides 12% dot multi with spell skills and 20% reduced duration of ailments on you. I think this is one that if you're playing a damage over time build that is dealing direct application damage over time, so using a spell like Soul Rend in order to directly inflict damage over time, you're not relying upon Ignite or Poison or some other form of ailment as a way of inflicting the damage. Even if that was an ailment inflicted by a spell, you are actually directly doing it with a spell skill. In that case, this is probably going to be a good cluster, assuming that the small nodes are not terrible. Right, so the next thing we've got here is a change that looks like it's more support to cast when stun builds. There's actually a bit more that's going on though. There is a cast mastery, and you'll see this 3 lines down in the patch notes from where we are now, where there was a custom mastery in 3.25 that provided 25% more spell damage if you've been stunned while casting recently. This is getting removed. It's getting replaced with something good, but not something that's good for the same builds. Now, Arcane Retaliation is replacing that, and this is going to be a cluster in the northwest of the Witch's starting location, providing 25% more spell damage if you've been stunned while casting recently, i.e. exactly what the old mastery used to do. That old mastery that's losing its identity, that is now going to be changed into something else that's good, and that is gain a power charge every second while channeling a spell. So the power charge node is really, really good, and that's one that we'll talk about now and skip over it when we get to it later in the notes. So on this new mastery, gaining a power charge every second while channeling a spell. If you are willing to commit to using a channeling skill directly, and it's a spell, then this is going to pay you off. Most of the time that you stop to channel a spell, you are going to cease channeling in less than 1 second. But frequently enough, you will channel a full second, and all you need to do is just have this go 1 power charge every 10 seconds or so. And as long as you do that, then you will be gaining more power charges than you lose, or they won't fall off. and particularly with a number of things that exist on the passive tree that extend the duration of charges. And these often are travel nodes. You don't really want to take them, but they're just there on your way to something better. For that reason, I think you'll find that this is something that is pretty reliable. However, of course, it does require you to directly channel your spells. It doesn't work if your spells are being channeled by a proxy, such as a totem. However, Arcane Retaliation is not something I recommend taking in most builds. It is sometimes good to have something that helps you dig yourself out of a hole, but really, more damage isn't what you want when you've just been stunned. What you want when you've just been stunned is either to get out of where you were, or alternately, more cast speed. If you had that instead, Arcane Retaliation would be something you might take on builds that weren't intentionally putting themselves into a position of getting stunned, and potentially using that while you are progressing your character and getting to the point that you can solve stun via other means. But while you're still suffering from stun, this is not going to be a solution to it. It's not really going to bail you out of circumstances where you have been stunned, and as a result, I don't think you should take this unless you know exactly what you're doing, and unless you've built your entire character around it, and you're going to be causing enemies to intentionally stun you in order to get benefits from other things. There is a cold passive mastery that relates to maximum cold resistance. It is being changed, and this is going to be a big improvement for certain builds. It's actually a tiny nerf in some weird cases as well. But for most people, you didn't take it as it used to be, but now you are definitely going to take it. This is now going to provide you with 1% cold damage over time multiplier for each 4% overcapped cold resistance on your character. Now, we discussed what overcapped cold resistance was, or specifically overcapped fire resistance, in the video on the enmity ring that we discussed a couple of days ago. But the quick recap is that if your character sheet says you've got 200 resist, but only 75% of them work, then that 125% wasted cold resist on your character, that's all overcapped. What this means in practice, though, is that once you've got your cold resistance capped on your character, if you pick up an item and it's got, say, 48% cold resistance on it, which is a maximum tier 1 roll, that's somewhat of a wasted modifier, but that wasted modifier becomes a very useful 12% cold dot multi. It's not actually as strong as a dedicated dot multi mod would be, but it's something that's available in different slots where you weren't going to get that, and it's also something that turns a previously useless stat on an item, but an item that you might have been willing to wear despite the fact that it had that useless mod on it, it turns that useless mod into something that is very, very much useful for your character. As a result, I think this is going to be pretty widely taken. It's something that is going to make gearing a lot more smooth. Just please remember that if you do shuffle around your gear and you no longer have a massively overcapped cold resistance, please remember to unspec this point and spend it somewhere more useful. And now we have a mastery that was very strong but very conditional that is getting replaced by something that is just unconditionally awesome for cold builds. The old mastery that's going away. Enemies near targets you shatter have a 20% chance to be covered in frost. This did something legitimately strong, but it was so conditional and so often just didn't work that people weren't very inspired by it. The new version of this has a drawback. That drawback is -30 to fire resist. You can easily make that one up, but it has a very powerful payoff for doing so, +1 to the level of all cold skill gems. Warning, this does not apply to cold skills that are generated from items. Replica, Allelopathy, sorry, this is not going to increase that level 25 Wintertide brand to a level 26. It does specify that it needs to be a gem. But despite that one case not working, this is an extremely, extremely powerful effect, and it's something I expect to see on almost every build that is casting cold skills in patch 3.26. What about if you're using a melee attack that is cold tagged? In that case, I think the answer is probably no. Yes, this is giving you a bit of a payoff, but it's costing you a point, and also the -30 fire res, it's not nothing. You do have to make that up somewhere. There is going to be some opportunity cost to wherever you're paying back that 30 fire res debt that you're into, and I don't think the overall package is quite worth it. So yeah, keep it in mind as an option if you're playing an attack-based build, but if you're playing something that is a spell build that is dealing cold damage, this is fantastic. And of course, where we were talking before about 25% more spell damage if you've been stunned while casting recently, this used to be available as a mastery. It's now its own cluster. The caster mastery that causes the final repeat of spells to have increased area of effect is getting better. I'm still just not sold on this. 40% is a reasonably good number, especially given this is only costing you 1 point, but it's so conditional that I'm just not sold on it. It's not terrible, but it's also not something I would be inspired to take. And then we have a staff mastery that provided 20% chance for double stun duration, and this one wasn't taken very often, so it's being replaced by a new mastery, 5% increased maximum mana per blue socket on your equipped staff, and 3% increased maximum life per red socket on your equipped staff. Now this mastery is interesting. If you're playing a build that is a spellcaster, chances are a very large number of the gems that you're using are blue, and as a result you might be in a position where you can get 5 blue gems into your staff, potentially even 6, although 6 does tend to come at a much higher cost. Now if you're playing an attack-based build, a lot more of the gems that you're likely to be using are red, especially if you're playing a physical attack-based build. So, with that in mind, if you're playing something like Shockwave Cyclone, this is potentially 15 or even 18% increased maximum life, which is a really, really good thing to get for a single mastery. And if you're playing a spellcasting build, then you could potentially get 20, 25, or less likely, but possibly 30% increased maximum mana. Ultimately, lots of good things there. The drawback, of course, is that there is no reward for any green supports that you might have, and you probably do want to have some green supports on your staff. Also note that white sockets, if you can get those onto your staff, they actually don't interact with this in any way, even if you socket a blue or red gem into them. After this, we have some FAQ questions that have been asked. Now, it's worth noting that a couple of these I've also submitted requests for further clarification on, but the first question is, how does equipping mercenaries with items work? And in particular, this focuses upon attribute requirements. And the answer essentially is, if the mercenary is intelligence aligned, then they can equip anything with an intelligence requirement. If they are intelligence and dexterity aligned, then they are not strength aligned, and therefore they're banned from equipping anything that has a strength requirement. So they're going to be able to equip 3 types of equipment by default. If they're intelligence based, that'll be int dex, and int strength. If they're int and strength, then they'll be able to go strength, int, or int and strength, but they won't be able to have anything that includes dexterity in it. The first question I've asked for further clarification on is what happens with tri-attribute items. For example, there is a rare type of armor that drops from Atsuri, and Uber Atsuri for that matter, that is hybrid strength, intelligence, and dexterity aligned. Likewise, grasping males have the same affinities. This one, the way that Grinding Gear Games have worded it here, it implies to me that a pure strength can use it, but a strength int cannot, because the strength int goes, oh, look, that's got dexterity on it. Terrible, I don't want to use that. Whereas the strength-based one goes, oh, that's got strength on it. I'm okay with that, I'll use it. That's my intuition, but I am definitely seeking clarification on this because ultimately, sometimes your intuition is wrong, and sometimes some of the wording on a particular FAQ is not exactly right. The second clarification that I've asked, though, is for something much more important, and that is leadership's price. This amulet is absolutely fantastic. This amulet comes out of Heist, but it's also something that doesn't really fit a lot of builds for characters. However, if mercenaries are able to benefit from while your 2 highest attributes are equal, then suddenly leadership's price becomes absolutely phenomenal. This is going to allow your mercenaries to inflict Scorch, Brittle, and Sap with every single attack, no matter what type of damage they do. And that'll also apply to spells, not just to attacks. So I'm seeking some clarification on leadership's price from GGG. If we don't get it from GGG, it'll be something that players will have to test in game, because I feel like this is one of the most powerful things if you're allowed to put it onto a mercenary. Will map modifiers affect rewards from mercenaries? Yes, increased quantity on a map area from map modifiers will increase the chances that you find an infamous mercenary in that area. The infamous mercenaries are the ones that have got special rewards. Special rewards such as the infamous modifiers that we were talking about before, or the Trarthus gems and the like. Are link skills able to target allied mercenaries? Yes, they are, with both all of the benefits and all of the drawbacks that would be associated with that link skill. Can gold appear as a reward in a mercenary's pouch? It cannot. Can mercenaries be renamed? Unfortunately, for those of you that were looking to have an edgy name for your mercenary, or maybe just to have something really silly like Lord Toucan, unfortunately, no, you're going to be stuck with the name that they were given when they were spawned. Can mercenaries use items with influence trigger skills, such as shape weapons that have cast on critical strike? The answer here is no, and the reason for that is that the gem system for the mercenaries just works fundamentally different to players. What's not clear here, and might be something interesting for a bit of follow-up from Grinding Gear Games, is what happens with other types of trigger skills. For instance, there is a unique mace called Chimera's Avarice. This unique mace triggers an icicle burst under certain circumstances. Is that able to be triggered by a mercenary? Here, I don't know what the answer is going to be. Will mercenaries be tradable? No, they're not. They're bound to account on acquire. Are mercenaries account bound or character bound? Account bound. Can I immediately use a very high level mercenary I previously recruited when leveling an alt? No. If you're 20 or more levels lower than a mercenary, you are not worth their time. However, 20 levels is a pretty big gap. I'm just thinking how crazy it's going to be if you're level 64 and you just suddenly go and get your main character's level 84 mercenary and they just go and start steamrolling everything. I wonder if they will get their levels adjusted or not in that sort of circumstance. Do mercenaries get passive skills from gear, such as anointed notables that are found on amulets or keystones that are found on certain unique items? The answer is yes to both of these. Now, this is something that's going to allow for a lot of customization of your mercenary under certain circumstances, and I think we might see a lot of unsuccessfully corrupted Stranglegrasps that wind up on mercenaries as a result of this. Are there any other sources of Trarthus gems? The answer here is no. They're not going to come from the Divine Font. You're only going to get them from mercenaries. You're only going to get them in maps and similar tier areas, and each individual gem is only available from a specific variety of mercenaries. Will Animate Guardian get an equipment interface similar to that of mercenaries? No. No, it will not. However, Animate Guardians will be improved. There's various quality of life improvements there. The new Pinnacle bosses, can they be witnessed by the Maven or fought as Uber versions? The answer to both of them is no. But they have already announced that there are Uber versions coming in the future. Whether they can be witnessed by the Maven is something they're not giving a definitive answer to here, but chances are they will be able to in the future, just not in 3.26. After you defeat the Syndicate Mastermind, can you still go and plunder all of the 4 safe houses? The answer is no. That's not going to be there, but it's also not going to feel as unfair because whilst you're missing out on it there, that was provided as compensation for the fact that you had ruined your betrayal board in order to get to the Syndicate Mastermind. You no longer have to ruin your board, and as a result, that's no longer going to feel as necessary. Does interacting with Syndicate members pause the game? Yes, it does. Thank you for that. That is a huge improvement. Are we still going to have to hire workers in Kingsmarch? Yes. So the town is going to be pre-built and completed, but workers will still need to be hired and paid for. And ultimately, the hiring process is pretty miserable in Kingsmarch if you're min-maxing it. Now, there is also a question relating to some corner case interactions with masteries. Trickster has the Polymath Ascendancy Notable, which provides a bonus for each mastery that you take that is of a different category. So if you had a Cold Mastery, a second Cold Mastery, and a Fire Mastery, this would count as 2 different categories. And the question here relates to the rune graphs that are being added. These are going to be something you're going to get by sending out shipments to Kalguran ports, replacing the Sun runes, the Journey runes, and the Power runes that you used to get in 3.25. So these rune graphs are going to work like tattoos, but they're going to be tattoos for masteries. For the purposes of Polymath, every single one of the rune graphs is considered to be in the same group as each other, but that is different to every other existing group that already exists on the passive tree. So if you have a cold, and a fire mastery, and then you go to one of those cold masteries and you rune graft it into something else, then you now have a cold mastery, a fire mastery, and a rune graft mastery. But if you then were to also rune graft over the fire mastery, then you would have a cold mastery and 2 from the rune graft package, and so that would only count as 2 for the purposes of Polymath. Anyways, that is all of the announcements for today. A little bit shorter than yesterday's video. Yesterday was a little bit crazy because by the time I finished the video and I had just made it public, Granny Games then went and published something else on me. Just before I leave it there though, I am going to be announcing a little bit of a promotion that I'll be running on my merchandise store. I'll put a link to that down in the description of this video below, but we have the Toucan backpacks, we have the Toucan shirts, and a number of other things. People in the United States have reported to me that shipping is pretty reasonable. If you're outside the United States, you might find it's a bit more expensive, but you will be warned of the exact price before you commit to anything, so you'll be able to decide whether or not to go ahead then. I'm going to leave it there. May your Varlorbs have interesting results.